In fiscal year 2023, the U.S. federal deficit was $1.7 trillion, up $320 billion from the prior year. But unusual accounting for President Joe Biden's student loan forgiveness plan suggests that the increase could actually be much higher, to the tune of roughly $1 trillion. And it's not stopping there. The Congressional Budget Office, the CBO, projects that the deficits will continue to grow over the next 3 decades. Now, why is this rising level of debt a problem? And what can be done about it? Here to discuss is John Diamond, director of the Baker Institute's Center for Public Finance and a Rice University economics professor. His research focuses on federal tax and expenditure policy issues, including the economic effects of corporate tax reform and the economic and distributional effects of fundamental tax reform. I'm David Satterfield, director of Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy in Houston, Texas, and this is Baker Briefing. John, thank you for joining me today.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Let's start with the basics. What is the budget deficit and how did we get here?
So the budget deficit is your annual shortfall between outlays and revenues. So if outlays are bigger than revenues, then you're going to run a deficit. If revenues are bigger than outlays, you run a surplus, which has only happened 3 times in the last 4 decades. And that was 99, 2000, and 2001. Currently, we're running historically large budget deficits. And so outlays are much larger than revenues. And as you mentioned, in fiscal year 23, outlays were 1.7 trillion higher than revenues. And CBO projects that in 2024, outlays will be about 1.6 trillion higher.
Now John, just to make sure we're comparing apples to apples, rather than the overall magnitude of dollars as percentage, are these the highest deficits in history?
No. So the highest deficit in history in terms of a percentage of GDP, so that we're not comparing a $99 to a 1906
Exactly.
dollar. The largest deficit on record was in 2020 when the deficit was 3.1 trillion. We followed that in 2021 with a 2.6 trillion deficit. Other than those 2 deficits, 2023 is the highest on record. Previously, so we never had a $1 trillion deficit. In 2019, the deficit was around $987 billion, so just under $1 trillion. But if you go back, like if we think about the early 2000s, when we were in the midst of the Iraq and Afghan wars, and everybody was up in arms about how large the deficits were. The deficits were running at about $400 billion.
And what happened to increase the percentage of GDP deficit beyond that period? Was it stimulus spending as a consequence of the pandemic? Was it the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq? What contributed to this?
There were really 2, there are 2 events that contributed to large short-term deficits. And then there's one big economic force, which was going to get us here anyways. We just got there a little quicker. So the events were the financial crisis of 2008. So our first $1 trillion deficit was in 2009, right after the financial crisis. And then COVID, which led to the 3.1 and the 2.6 trillion dollar deficits. So those events just exploded the deficit in a single year. And that's because, in COVID, we had the $2.2 trillion CARES Act. And then we followed that with the American Rescue Plan. And we've had all of these infrastructure
John,
and investments acts.
That was then. Why has the deficit continued and is projected to continue to grow?
So the other issue that's causing the deficit to grow is demographics. And demographics are the force that's going to push us from today, where the deficit is about 5.7% of GDP, to a number in 2034 of maybe upwards of 6.5.
Demographics.
Demographics.
Explain.
People are getting older. Old people. We spend a lot of money on old people through two programs: Social Security and Medicare. And so as people age, both of those programs are getting very expensive. Both are fiscally insolvent in a long-term view. So Social Security's trust fund has funds currently in it. Those funds are projected to be exhausted in 2034. When that happens, if Congress does not act, Social Security benefits would need to be cut by 20%. In order, that's all we could fund without additional revenues being dedicated. So payroll taxes will only be able to fund 80% of Social Security benefits unless Congress acts to do something differently.
Let's assume, John, that Social Security and Medicare remain the third political rails of entitlement programs. That is, you can't touch them. And they are funded. And they are not reformed in terms of eligibility ages or eliminating the ability to draw benefits if your income levels are above a certain point. Two of the proposals we understand have been made. Let's assume that doesn't happen. How do you fix the deficit if those critical entitlements remain in place? Can you?
You cannot. So in that situation that you just laid out, the debt is predicted by 2054 to be 186% of GDP. And that's up from it's about 120% today.
Now, I remember, John, not so many years ago when we were assessing foreign government debt to GDP, anything that got above about 130, 135% was viewed as catastrophic. Is the same true for the United States? What are the consequences of this?
I think the United States definitely has more room because we're the financial zone of stability, and everybody wants U.S. dollars. So assuming that we continue to be the world's reserve currency, that gives us more room than anyone else. But we can already see why it's so important not to run deficits this large. So Social Security and Medicare are your largest two government programs. We spend, so this year we're going to spend about $1.4 trillion on Social Security and around $800 billion on Medicare. I think it's 870. Well, net interest on the debt this year is going to be about $800 billion. It is now the third largest program of the federal government. It's larger than defense.
The federal debt payment.
Interest
on the federal
not
debt.
Not principal, just
the
paying
interest
the interest.
Is the third largest program in the budget.
And it's only getting larger over time. That can't continue. Something has to change. If we don't, can we do it if we don't reform entitlements? I don't think so.
All right. Now, if Secretary of the Treasury, Jim Baker, were with us right now, I know what he'd be saying. He'd hit this table and he'd say, I don't understand how the Treasury Department is going to deal with a debt book like this, and I'm worried about the impact on the dollar. And what about that last point? Impact on the dollar.
Well, it's definitely going to have an impact on the dollar. It's also going to have an impact on dollars in people's pockets through inflation. The only thing there is we're not alone in this. The rest of the world has an aging population as well. It's really a worldwide problem. So relatively, are we going to be relatively worse than other countries? No, we're actually probably in better shape than other countries because we're we take more people in. We have more people want to come to the U.S. More immigrants want to come to the U.S. and that can replenish the younger age groups in your population rather quickly. So, is it doomsday? No, I think in a relative sense we have an advantage over the rest of the world, who's all dealing with this problem. Is it without major complications? Not at all. We're coming off of 9.1% inflation 2 years ago. One of the effects of continuing to run large deficits is the potential for higher inflation. Another effect is that you have to constantly be importing lots of goods. So one of the economic forces going on right now is we're trying to produce more at home. Things like chips and more infrastructure. We want to bring a lot back to the U.S. for national security reasons. Well, that has to be offset. Usually if you run large deficits, then you have to import a lot of foreign goods. And so if we want to create more at home, we need to match that or pair that with running smaller deficits. Otherwise, the dollar will continue to kind of be out of whack with the rest of the world's currencies.
So let me try to project forward in the U.S. presidential political debate. If, in fact, there are still more restrictive immigration policies adopted, if there is, in fact, a stricter policy towards China and Chinese imports to the United States, more of this home shoring approach, and there is no addressal of the deficit, does all of this just exponentially increase the problem?
Absolutely. I like to think of this as we're leaving the Fed on an island to fight inflation by itself, while everyone else does stuff to make the inflation problem worse. Tariffs, a 10% tariff across the board, that's like you're just asking for higher prices. You're asking for supply chain issues. All of these things are only going to make the Fed's job harder, and we've already seen the negative effect of the Fed raising rates. So if we force the Fed into a situation where they even have to raise rates higher, well, that has another really bad effect. It raises net interest payments on the debt.
And John, let's take the moment to elaborate on the role of the Fed. There is a tendency, including in the punditry, to look at the Fed as the source of all resolutions or all problems. But the Fed only deals with one aspect of the budget and its issues, or the currency and its issues. And that's monetary policy, not fiscal policy, not business policy. How much can the Fed do to address this problem we're talking about?
Well, they have lots of tools. The question is, can do their tools work? And I think you nailed it. We need fiscal policy to match monetary policy. In our current world, fiscal policy is working against monetary policy. And that we can't continue that. At some point, policymakers have to get on the same page with the Fed. And, we should be the Fed has two goals, full employment and price stability. Policy should be passed with those same two goals in mind.
If we can't grapple with the fundamental structural issues here because they're just politically too hard, why can't we just increase the debt limit indefinitely? What's the problem with that?
I've already addressed that. The problem with an ever-growing debt is just like if you were a household and you had ever-growing credit card debt, your minimum payments would eat up a larger and larger chunk of your income. So net interest payments on the debt are the third largest government program. If we continue down this road, soon enough, they'll be the largest. And that crowds out a lot of important government expenditures. That's going to crowd out mandatory expenditures, discretionary expenditures, military expenditures. And then the problem is if you say, okay, well, let's just go raise more taxes. If you raise more revenues, yeah, maybe that'll help you for a little bit. But if those revenues decrease economic growth, so all of these projections include this idea that the economy is going to grow at 2 percentage points per year. Well, if the economy only grows at 1.5 percentage points, then you have a 0.5 percentage point of GDP that's now going to have to be cut between your spending and taxes difference. And so that makes the problem harder.
John, 40,000-foot takeaway. Current tax structures, are they right? Are they wrong? Are they about right? What would you do if you could wave your wand on the tax structures in place for corporate, individuals, and personal taxes?
So current tax structures are temporary. In fact, the big problem that we face, and all of these budget numbers assume that the Tax Cut and Jobs Act, the 2017 tax cut passed by the House and signed by President Trump, they all expire at the end of 2025. And so taxes will go back to pre-17 law. All of the CBO's projections on deficits assume that we let that happen. CBO and JCT have also been putting out estimates that extending those tax cuts would cost an extra $400 to $500 billion over a 10-year period. So right now, the whole tax code or much of the individual tax code is temporary. We need to completely reform it. We don't have the funds to have a $500 billion extension. There's a lot of issues that need to be addressed, and that, there are things like some people aren't happy with the state and local cap on income taxes, on state and local income taxes. There's the AMT issue, which is going to throw more and more people, take more and more people's deductions away, and increase tax rates on more and more people. And then there's just a general sense that we once again have this Swiss cheese revenue system where there's like base laws of how we're going to collect revenues, and then there's just all of these holes cut through it for the special interest and the loopholes that have been created. And so we need something similar to the 1986 reform under Secretary Baker, where we go back in and create a tax system that we understand and that makes sense and that actually tries to collect revenue in an efficient manner.
Okay, Secretary Baker has spoken about what happened then, and he makes two fundamental points. First, you need direct presidential hands-on leadership, where the president takes onto their shoulders the burden as well as the praise, if it comes, for what is being done. And you need the willingness of the president to work with the leaders of both parties in a non-gotcha fashion, where they agree there'll be no accusations after the fact directed at either side. Everyone is in the boat together. Now, is that likely to be possible?
Right now, our political system is just a mess. I mean, if you think about this problem, neither party wants to solve this problem. One side wants to spend more. One side wants to cut taxes. Usually the agreement is we'll let you spend more if you let us cut taxes. That makes the whole problem worse. The latest, this year they were trying to pass a bill. It was exactly that. There were going to be some tax reductions for businesses. And on the other end, we were going to spend a lot through the tax system by raising the child tax credit. It's exactly the solution we can't afford. Less revenues, more spending, larger deficits. And that seems to be the status quo. No one seems to be thinking about actually true reform that would start to bring the budget into an affordable or a sustainable place. And so I don't think it's hopeful right now in this moment that our politicians are going to solve this problem in the next couple of years.
Sort of a final point. I was in the Clinton administration at the White House during those wonderful years.
Great years.
And Bill Clinton acknowledged, presidents come, presidents go. The budget cycles come, the budget cycles go, and sometimes you're lucky and sometimes you're not. But his view was the ability of the president to shape these cycles, as opposed to either take advantage or suffer from them, as George Bush 41 did. That's very limited. Was he being too modest? Does the president, in fact, have, if he chooses to exercise his authority, even in the face of a difficult, polarized Congress, the ability to fundamentally affect these kinds of issues?
I think he was being too modest. I think if we followed a framework from the Clinton years of reduced regulations, cutting spending, he actually cut taxes. And he ended up in a surplus. Now, he was also right. We were in one of the hottest stock markets ever, two technology bubbles pushing stock values through the roof, which definitely helped. But the long-term impacts of a program that encourages economic growth and puts a lid on spending, so just reduce spending growth, keep your economy growing at a good clip, that's the first way we can start to get a hold of this problem. If we don't have to solve the problem right here and right now. We don't need to balance the budget tomorrow. That is not the solution at all. It would be nice if we could just get a deficit that equaled economic growth. So if your economy is growing at 2% and your deficit's growing at 2%, debt to GDP is constant. So there we've stopped the bleeding. If we can get the deficit 2/10 of a percentage point below growth, say our deficit's 1.8% and our GDP grows at 2%, then debt to GDP is falling very slowly, but it's falling. And then you do that over a really long period of time, and you can get yourself back into a sustainable budget situation. We just don't seem to have we're not making any movements towards that. In fact, we're going the opposite direction. And at some point, and I don't know when that is, but at some point that has to stop. And unfortunately, that usually doesn't stop until it's a crisis. And that's unfortunate because crises always cost a lot more money than if you did it up front before you hit the crisis. So hoping that policymakers will do something like the Simpson-Bowles Commission or the National Commission on Fiscal Responsibility, in which we have a national conversation about how much we want to spend, how much we want to raise in revenues. We bring those two numbers close enough together so that our deficit is just a bit smaller than our GDP growth. That would be the best place to start.
John, I could not agree more, but in a political world in which we cannot have a national conversation on whether the sun rises in the east and sets in the west, that's a pretty high bar.
It is
to set. But it is absolutely critical that the facts of the situation stay out there and the consequences of failure to address structurally and fundamentally those facts be outlined as clearly as possible as well. We'll be continuing this discussion. And we'll end there. Thank you for joining us, John.
Thank you. This was very, very, very interesting.
The Baker Briefing is brought to you by the Baker Institute for Public Policy, which provides meaningful, nonpartisan policy analysis on the most critical challenges facing Texas, the U.S., and the world. It is produced by Victoria Jupp, Shannon Moriarty, and Karina Zamel. AV production is led by Kevin Young. Be sure to visit us at bakerinstitute.org to learn more. Thank you for listening.